Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me this afternoon, we have Rika Khurdayan, U.S. Chief Legal Officer of Bitstamp, Cathy Yoon, General Counsel at Wormhole Foundation, and Marc D'Annunzio, General Counsel at Bakkt. We're here to discuss balancing regulation with the support for innovation to ensure the U.S. remains competitive in the global crypto market. It's great to have everyone with us. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. And Rika, let's start and consider the current state of the SEC as, it's a common theme within the industry as we're looking for guidance to provide somewhat of a framework around the digital asset space.
Certainly, and great to be back. Thanks for having me. I'm Chief Legal Officer of Bitstamp. I'll do a quick intro. I don't know if everyone is familiar with Bitstamp, one of the longest running cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. We've been in operation since 2011, hold over 50 licenses worldwide, including the coveted Bit license issued by New York Department of State. And probably our viewers and listeners have heard today, we've just announced acquisition by Robinhood. Very excited, couldn't hope for a better partner. We really share this compliance forward approach to operations and culture. So the big news here at Bitstamp. And on the regulatory front, we've certainly seen a lot of sort of jurisdictional turf war between the two main agencies in the US, the SEC and the CFTC, as to how we define and look at the assets and various types of operations and transactions, including these assets. So I think we have all been waiting for more regulatory clarity in this space that would tremendously help operators like ourselves and many other crypto projects to move forward and innovate and introduce new products and services into the market. Recently, we have seen some attempts on the legislative front to sort of bring together the various definitions of or interpretations of what a digital asset could be. The latest attempt, and certainly a very big effort, was the FIT 21 Act that was unfortunately vetoed. But certainly it seems to attempt to bring together this jurisdictional differences between how the CFTC and the SEC are trying to regulate the space.
Yeah, and Cathy, you and I have discussed this before. Certainly, I mean, there is a need for regulatory clarity, not even in terms of being able to foster innovation, but being able to feel more confident in terms of how firms are able to operate.
Yeah, it's frustrating because you have a lot of great projects who want to operate in the US. And we're losing a lot of great innovation leaving the shores. And when we ask for regulatory clarity, it's not FIT 21, unfortunately, which actually that wasn't the one that was vetoed. It was the repeal of SAB 121 that was vetoed. And the fortunate thing about FIT 121 is that it showed great bipartisan support in the House. We have yet to see if it's going to go to the Senate or not for voting. But I think as an industry, we look for legislation like that as ways to kind of glom onto hope that our congressional leaders in the United States are finally starting to understand what we are doing in the space and what we are trying to build and trying to find ways to keep it on US soil. But at the same time, until we get something, we're going to see great projects, including Wormhole Foundation, who's not set up in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I have developers coming to me all the time saying they want to work for the project, but they're here. And so that's frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And Marc, what's so interesting is out of all the issues to gain bipartisan support, it happens to be digital assets. I mean, I wonder if it has something to do with commentary around the presidential election.
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of, it's interesting actually, the meeting that I came out of before we started this panel was actually a monthly listing that we have internally of our coin listing committee, which is always a lively discussion. And we at Bakkt purchased another platform last year called Apex Crypto, and that was in the midst of a frenzy of SEC activity, enforcement actions, and lawsuits against Coinbase and Kraken and several others. And on the basis of what we saw as a very choppy period in the market, we delisted more than 30 of the coins that Apex Crypto had historically offered, right? Because several of them were being named and others were really uncertain. Fast forward 14 months after the closing of that acquisition, and I'm very fairly asked by folks within the business, well, what's changed? Is there anything that, any tea leaves that we can point to? And I think Cathy put it very well. I think we tend to latch on to hope at the slightest provocation. We've met with folks on Capitol Hill, as I suspect everyone has. And I think there's a lot of appreciation for the potential in the crypto industry and a lot of desire to want to do something. That progress is slow. It's probably slower in an election year than it is in an average year, which is saying something. And at the same time, the other thing that I would say is we've moved, I think, from an attitude of flat nose to everything to what really feels like unpredictability, even at the SEC. I did not think, I'll call myself on the carpet. I did not think we were anywhere close to ETFs being approved. I don't think I was alone in that fact, but I would have staked my reputation on that. And lo and behold, those approvals came through very recently. And so it's almost a period of cognitive dissonance, right? Of you're going to rail against the crypto industry on Tuesday, and then on Thursday, you'll make these things available to retail investors. And I think, the polite way to say that is we continue to desire clarity. The more maybe, pessimistic way to say it is Washington, D.C. is a very political town, and this may have a lot more to do with political realities than what legal scholars like the three of us will sit here and banter about on a call. So
right.
Again,
and Marc, that's a safe bet that you made, because we just came back from Consensus last week and it was very capital markets focused and regulatory focused this year. Great to see that maturation within the space. And it was general consensus that the ETH, approval for applications was fortuitous timing, because virtually 99% of the people that we met with did not expect that either. But Cathy, you had mentioned, the brain drain and the talent ex-US, we're seeing that exodus, but the EU seems to have this somewhat figured out. They have MiCA, they have an AI framework, they have, Digital Services Act framework. You're seeing established crypto regulation in Southeast Asia, in the UK, other areas of the world. What is the disconnect outside of perhaps the politics for the US to be able to establish a framework?
I wish I knew. I mean, you would think that the U.S. would be leaders in this space at this point. We had, .coms. Technology is, the U.S. kind of reigns supreme from the technology perspective. So it's mind-boggling that the U.S. isn't leading from this perspective. As for something like MiCA, I think it's a great first step. I think it's great that there is legislation out there. I wouldn't want to copy that in the United States. I believe it's a little too prescriptive. It's a little too rigid. It doesn't allow, where you're going to face the same things in a few years when you kind of run up against the edges of it. And I don't think there's a lot of room. There's not a lot of wiggle room with MiCA. In Asia, you're seeing some jurisdictions taking 2 steps forward, but then you also see the same jurisdictions taking a step backwards. I think we're going to see a lot of that over the next few years. Jurisdictions want to see development. They want to embrace, they want to be leaders in terms of new technology and innovation, want to bring jobs to their jurisdictions. And this is a great way to do that. But at the same time, a lot of the legislation and proposals that you're seeing globally, there is this hope out there, but there are also guardrails in place because people are scared and no one wants any blow up to happen on their watch. So while there's a lot of more hope, ex-US, I think it's still as long as they're allowing themselves to have this be a work in progress and to grow with what they learn, I think that would be the best situation for those jurisdictions.
Right. And
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I'll add a couple of words. I think it's still too early to say which regulatory framework and in which jurisdiction would make the most sense. MiCA doesn't go into full effect until December of this year. And I actually think we will learn quite a bit from it by observing how it works in, taking it from theory to actually practice. And if that's an operational framework and if there are any particular issues that might arise.
Yeah, and I would agree. I see, Marc, you're shaking your head as Cathy was speaking that, copying the framework wouldn't necessarily work within US legislation. And I also think because we are leaders in traditional capital markets, that we want to be perceived somewhat as architects of framework around the digital asset space. I think that that's also a nuance that we need to recognize as well.
Yeah, I think all of what's been said is right. I also don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, right? And what
Right.
we have in the States today is primarily a set of invisible third rails that you don't see, that don't light up. And if I step out of my light up, if Cathy steps on them, she lights up, and then everybody can say, well, I'm not going to go over there, right? And that's something. I mean, it's not an absence of rules, but it is not the same as a framework, even if that framework is imperfect or not as flexible as it needs to be, for me to be able to say to my business lead, here are the coins that we can list. Here are the coins that we need to list to get a broker dealer. And by the way, here's how we get a special purpose broker dealer to do that. And here are ones that are maybe phase 3 coins that people have yet to figure, even something as fundamental as that, which is really, really basic when you talk about, the crypto space. And so again, it will be interesting to see how this plays out. I just wish we weren't only looking at other jurisdictions to see how it played out. I wish that the US were in more of a leadership position. And again, I think, and I think it was said earlier on this call, I think in the House, you have very active thought leadership about that on a bipartisan basis. It doesn't feel like the Senate is quite to that point. But I am optimistic that, there are people who think about this industry in the right way and think about the role that a framework can play, and not just a series of enforcement actions. And again, I'm
Right.
cautiously optimistic that, we'll see progress there, either there or, who knows, maybe everyone is sort of hedging their bets on what happens in November, and is there a different administration, and then what happens, and who runs the SEC and the other agencies. But even leaving all of that to the side, which is always risky when you're talking about DC as a partisan city, there is a clear case, right? We all want the US to be a global leader in technology, or we should. We all want, crypto to be used for good purposes, not bad. And so taking a first step toward that is better than waiting to see what happens in other jurisdictions.
Yeah. And I think, Cathy, that's a great point that Marc makes, that, regulation by enforcement isn't necessarily the most effective strategy. As I understand MiCA, the framework that they're proposing, it's not as if they're trying to fit digital assets within an equity or commodity bucket, that they're treating it as its own asset class. Is that correct? And if so, do you think that is a logical approach to take?
This is going to be such a lawyer answer. It depends. Right. And I hate giving that answer. The thing is, like, if you look at traditional capital markets, we have a framework, and you have an idea of what to expect. To treat something brand new just for digital assets, it's just focusing more on the financial and investment sides of this. There's so much more. And so when you're talking about utility, when you're thinking of blockchain-based digital identity, when you're talking about NFTs, it doesn't make sense. I don't know. I mean, those are things that we don't currently have, rules and regulations for when it comes to art or collectibles. And so for me, I just don't see the point in creating a whole new regime for things that we already have digital representations of. So I think it really is a wait and see approach at this point, to see how well it works out, to see if it's something that we should latch onto as an approach.
See, and I think that's an intelligent answer, Rika, because I think we need to exercise some patience here as well. We know technology moves at an exponential rate relative to the law. establishing law and a regulatory framework, it's not easy. It's hard work, and there's multiple parties and agencies and legislators that are involved. It's not something that you can just plug and play and it happens. There is, a modicum of patience that needs to be exerted here as well.
Yes, indeed. I am actually a very strong believer that a workable framework would move away from trying to define an asset and regulating an asset to regulating an activity. Because as we all know, you can create an investment contract pretty much out of anything. You can build a derivatives product on top of anything. That doesn't necessarily make the underlying asset an investment contract or a derivative product, right? And we've been spinning wheels trying to figure out how to define what a digital asset is and how to regulate it. And I think the path of least resistance would be to focus on the activity and what do the various industry participants do with this asset.
Yeah, and Marc, that's a great point that Rika makes, and kind of sidestepping a bit here. We did some work recently on using AI in HR, human resources practices. Now, the commissioner from the EEOC on the show, and he had mentioned to us that the law's in place, regardless if it's humans going through resumes or whatever's happening in the employment world, or AI, you still have to adhere to the framework that's in place. So it's not as if it's totally, a black box in no man's land that's out there.
Yeah, the other way I think about this is, and lawyers love taxonomy, right? Like they love it. They love to put things in boxes and define them, and so it's unsurprising to me that that's where the discussion about how to regulate crypto has started. It is surprising to me that in a lot of rooms it hasn't fundamentally moved beyond that. And I like the idea of saying, let's stop talking about what kind of animal it is, and let's talk about what it does or what its primary purpose is. And further, it is my own sort of private view that if I took, the people at the SEC and the CFTC and the banking regulators and, name whoever you want and lock them in a room and said, you get a 3x5 card to write your top 5 priorities for what you want to accomplish, right? Is it disclosure? Is it investor protection? Is it financial stability? Those answers would actually probably look more similar than they would different. And so if we know what we want to achieve and we look to the primary purpose of these tokens or the functionality of these tokens, I think this task actually gets a lot easier than arguing about, oh my gosh, is it a commodity or is it security? Let me think back, let me think back to the Howey test from 20 years ago when I was sitting in a law school classroom and try to figure. I think that there is potentially an easier way, a more practical way for us to think through these classifications to achieve, again, the top 5 goals on probably every regulator's list.
Yeah, but I also think that we're doing, as a space, a bad job of trying to frame that discussion and the narrative. We're not talking DC talk, right? We can't go in there and just talk about the underlying asset and tokens and all this other stuff. We're not talking about the jobs that we could bring to, just the normal talk that any politician would want to hear. It's how are you going to generate tax revenue? How are you going to generate revenue in a jurisdiction? How are you going to bring people, in the mid-Hudson Valley, there's an effort to push rural broadband. Those are the things that we should all be focusing on and finding ways for crypto to enhance that narrative. And I think once we kind of change the narrative in that direction, it makes talking about our space so much more tangible.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that the both of you make, where, Marc had mentioned we try and compartmentalize all of these things, but if you talk DC and you kind of think about the law in terms of how it's supposed to evolve, that's what it's designed for, versus having, a strict jump off point of what, trying to put something in another box again, when perhaps, allowing it to evolve might be a more effective strategy versus having to reinvent the wheel.
And I think, yeah, and to Cathy's point, I think we've tried to amplify that in our own discussions on the legislative side, to say it's one thing to say in a nebulous way, this is technology, you should want us to be a technology leader. And somebody else, the congressman looked at me and says, what does it do? Why do I care, right? Like, why do I want to encourage this? Is this just to be sitting in their basement speculating on a coin that no one has heard of? Is this somebody running a Ponzi scheme with new tech? What does this do that my constituents care about or that they should care about? What problems are you solving, right? And, you know, there are 1,000 different solutions to problems that people may or may not know that they have. But if you can find 2 or 3 examples of that to say, here's something that you should care about, here's something that your constituents care about, here's a problem that's getting solved in a very elegant way, then the gears start to move. And then, you know, then if necessary, you can get into more of the lawyer talk of,
Right.
you know, taxonomy or the like. But I think, and I agree with you, Cathy, I think as an industry, crypto, and I don't mean this as a value judgment. We all, you know, sometimes can't see the forest for the trees, but I think you fall into being so deep in those weeds that you forget to think about it like a normal. I should just go talk to my parents about this, right? I mean, because that's actually a good barometer to say, now, what does this do again? Like, what is this for? And if you can give those examples of practical problem-solving applications of the technology, then people stop talking about FTX, right? And then then you really get more traction.
You do. And Rika, I think these are excellent points that have been made because, again, mentioning we just came back from consensus, another big theme was, let's talk about user experience, right? Let's get out of this narrative where we're focused on core architecture, what the developers, what the engineers are seeing. The average person, even institutions, they want to get from point A to point B, have a seamless experience, and being able to, you know, explain what digital assets brings to your constituency or how users can have a more efficient experience. Because the fact of the matter is, in the US and other Western areas of the world, we tend to think very Western centric. Meanwhile, this type of technology is being leveraged for cross-border payments, or in other areas, you know, leveraging stable coins where inflation is a big concern. And they're building micro economies and digital economies. It's not just about the trading of said, you know, asset.
I mean, certainly, I think a lot of companies out there are focusing not on the user experience, but also understanding what is it that users really need to be able to adopt these assets more smoothly. Retail users, institutional users, right? We need to ensure that the product is easy to use, that the settlement process goes smoothly, that there is enough transparency, there is enough security. Yeah, all very important initiatives that we're definitely focusing on at Bitstamp.
All right. Well, we are certainly over time, but great conversation. Appreciate everyone's insight on Trade Talks. Thanks for joining me. And thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.